think the
with my
media
morning tea.
sometimes overstates the sort of level of alarm people should have about terrorism and this kind of chaos as opposed to a longer term problem of climate change and epidemic disease.
Absolutely. And, I don't blame the media for that. What's the famous saying about local newscasts, right? If it bleeds, it leads. The problems of terrorism and dysfunction and chaos, along with plane crashes and a few other things, that's the equivalent when it comes to covering international affairs.
Is the media to blame? Are we overhyping the realities that the world is facing against terrorism? Hello, everyone. I'm Adrienne Batra. Thank you very much for staying with us here at Sun News as we continue with Straight Talk. This is our top story, so let's get straight to it. And joining us is JJ McCullough, John Downs, and Marissa Senkew. All of our Sun News contributors are here ready to duke this out. JJ, let me start with you. That was a pretty wide-ranging discussion that U.S. President Barack Obama had with Vox, but that's the part that everyone seems to be picking apart. What's your thoughts?
My thoughts is that you sort of have two liberal people talking together and they reach a fairly conventional liberal conclusion, which is that terrorism, as they were framing it, is largely a distraction from issues that they'd rather be talking about, such as climate change, such as, the expansion of government in a whole host of different ways. And I do think that this is largely a partisan issue. I think that the left largely sees terrorism in the same way that they used to see the Cold War. They see military policy in general as kind of a distraction from domestic policies, which what they would much rather focus their effort on. And so I do think that this has a very strong ideological component to it that sort of transcends any sort of more neutral, objective analysis of what, sort of threats the world is actually facing.
John?
Well, that said, I still think it's true, especially even from a local perspective. If you look at local news, and it's the same in international, but maybe differently here in Canada than it might be in other ways. But look, having worked in newsrooms, I can tell you ultimately what a news director wants to put out there is compelling content. So I worked in radio, good audio made for a good story. If that story involved cars crashing or planes crashing or gunfire coming from somewhere in the Middle East, that'll go in there. But the president is right. Is it a distraction? Look, we only see one element of this, keep in mind. We've talked about it in the past. With Muslims being the biggest victims of groups like ISIS, we only see part of the story. We are fed part of the story because if it's far away and it doesn't impact white people like us or people like Canadians, then we don't really care.
What about what Obama said is true, that he's trying to diminish the threat that is ISIS? See, this is the problem. Obama says if it bleeds, it leads. No, your inane comments are actually what's leading the story right now. And this is the bigger problem than that of moral relativism. Moral relativism, equivalence, ignorance, which sort of at the center of the Democratic Party's foibles when it comes to foreign policy. I don't think that we're talking enough about ISIS. I don't think we're making a big enough deal about ISIS because there are still people like Barack Obama that don't seem to get how grave of a threat it is.
See, here's the challenge with your assertion, I think, John, is that the issue of ISIS, the issue of what one of the biggest threats of the world is facing is terrorism. It has hit us at home. So when we talk about...
Oh, but in a very, very minor way. The fact that we had 2 people killed and that, really brought our nation to a standstill.
Yes, but John, it's not from lack of trying, right?
Exactly.
In British Columbia right now, we're having a trial over an attempted attack to blow up the BC legislature on Canada Day some years ago. That could have potentially killed hundreds, if not thousands of people. Same with the Via Rail trial that you folks are having back east.
But
it's not for lack of trying.
It's a drop in the bucket.
No, but
it's
John,
a drop
you
in the
fail to
bucket.
acknowledge that
We're gonna
motive
see
matters.
Dozens and dozens, if not hundreds of people killed today in the globe, and we're not going to hear about it. It happens. It happens in Pakistan on a daily basis. It happens in Iraq, not associated, by the way, with ISIS, on a daily basis. Same thing in Syria.
But just because we are able to thwart these threats does not suggest in any respect that it is somehow not as grave as it actually is.
No, we think as Canadians that we're more important than all the other people being killed. If we actually put in perspective how many people are dying at the hands of terrorists, white people are a drop in the bucket. But certain media would have us believe that they're the only ones that these groups are going after, and we're not. We're just a little tougher to access.
I don't think that that's actually the case, to be honest with you. I think that it's more about ensuring that the Canadian public is getting a broad range of a reality that every country, including Canada, is facing. Yes, do I think that there's a bit of desensitization to those when we hear about a story in Pakistan, when we hear about a shop being blown up in Afghanistan? Yeah, I think that people are getting a little tuned out to that. But suddenly we're paying acute attention, JJ, when it is the VIA rail bombing, it's the blowing up the BC case, it is the shooting in Ottawa or the issue in Quebec. Suddenly, that global political issue hits home.
Yes, because I think that I think that Canadians are not unjustified in believing that we have a higher rate of we have a higher standard of sort of national security and safety than, say, Pakistan or Afghanistan. That Canadians have a right to feel safer in their homes and in places of public transportation and whatnot than the people in the Middle East do, just because we're a more sophisticated, advanced country that supposedly has better policing and whatnot for these kinds of things. Because I do think that is the core of why we are freaked out about terrorism, is because it is so incompatible with what we understand our civilization on our society to be. The concept of just a random attack, possibly killing hundreds of people for just some random fundamentalist, religiously inspired attack of chauvinism, that does seem really incompatible with everything that we take for granted about our society, which is why, it gets us disproportionately freaked out. And I don't think that those freakouts are unjustified.
Now, let me ask you this, Marissa. Do you think that we in the media are playing a bit of catch up when it comes to reporting on ISIS? Because for a long time, they were doing what they were doing, but it sort of lay dormant. And then all of a sudden, social media was really picking up on it. And then it was the first brutal beheading of the American journalist that we saw that really, focused our attention so quickly.
Mosul, which is where Christianity originated, predates Islam. There were hundreds of thousands of Christians in Iraq and Syria that were fled from their homes, and the media didn't pick up on it. So to that point, I would say perhaps. But when Barack Obama made these comments, I was reminded of a CNN reporter who tweeted out after the Paris attacks. Her name's Sally Cohn. She said, since 9/11, right-wing extremists, including anti-abortion activists, have killed more Americans than Islamic extremists. I mean, this perception is something that all liberals alike actually do believe, and Barack Obama sort of echoed that with his perception. How is that true? Because you are failing to recognize that motive matters.
Okay, and it does, and that's what makes it a compelling story. But look, you are far more likely to die in a car crash in wherever you are, in Vancouver and Calgary and Toronto today, than you are at the hands of terrorists. That's just not. Just look at the risks.
We have massive propaganda campaigns about car safety and how to drive responsibly and not drink and drive. I mean, we're constantly subjected to massive freakouts about the importance of driving safely. So why is it unjustified to have similar apprehension about terrorism, which has the potential to kill hundreds of people in one swoop if it's successful?
Risks, and whether or not it's because those risks are being mitigated by the fact that we do have much better terror prevention or security, or the fact that the vast majority of Canadians are rational human beings. And you can't deny the fact that when you've got a region of the world, whether it is Pakistan, Iraq, Syria, or Nigeria, for crying out loud, where you've got a lot of the population that are uneducated, that are extremist in their views, very often religious extremism, there is a way better threat that you're going to be at risk there. So I'm not saying that it's not a freak out, but let's be honest, we only started freaking out with ISIS when white people started getting killed. That's what happens. White people died, then we pay attention.
Well, Canadians are dying, and I don't think it's unjustifiable for Canadians to be concerned about the safety of other Canadians before they're concerned about the safety of, people 1,000 miles away in some other country. I don't think that that's just a racist, chauvinistic thing. No, I think that's just common sense.
But a lot of it has to do with the fact that we believe, we feel very isolated because we are so far away. But a 12, 13-hour plane trip is not really that much, and that's all it takes, let alone someone who's here to do something. So I think we do have to wake up. There's no question about it. But let's still not overstate risks compared to other risks.
The risk is still there. It's just that our security apparatus or our technology is that much more capable of thwarting these types of events.
Absolutely.
The risk is still
there.
there.
So why should we worry about it to the point where we're sweating our butts off because there's really not a hell of a lot we as individuals.
Because on 9/11, 2 planes flew into a building and killed thousands of Americans.
And there was intelligence from both the FBI and the CIA suggesting that could happen. And then, in fact, that it was imminent. And people didn't wake up until that happened. So
I do think that the left overstates the degree to which people are actually freaking out about this kind of thing. I think people have an appropriate level of freaking out about it, frankly. I mean, when you poll Canadians and say, well, what's the most important issue facing you in the 2015 election? They don't say terrorism, they don't say national security, they say still economy, healthcare, conventional things like that. I think people have an appropriate level of fear because, as I said, it only takes one crank to possibly kill 100, 200, 300,000 of people. And I think that, it's appropriate to be nervous in the same way that it's appropriate to be nervous about all aspects of physical safety, about being nervous about being murdered or raped or whatever, but just keeping it in the appropriate sort of hierarchy of fears and importance in your day-to-day life.
Okay, in the context of what the president has said, of course, now we have unequivocal confirmation from her family that the American aid worker Kayla Mueller has indeed been killed. We haven't had confirmation as to how that has happened. ISIS was trying to spin that it was actually coalition forces, but no one's buying that. That was just more their propaganda. So, John, in light of that, that's a significant story, and they released a letter that she had written to her family. How would the president like that to be covered then, in light of what he just said? What do you think?
Well, because the information's not out there in terms of what happened exactly. I have trouble believing that ISIS would want to claim responsibility if they had an active role in her death. I have a feeling something else did happen. And quite frankly, if it was something that might have been accidental, I think it was probably a far better fate than might have been held for, a few weeks or months ahead.
Marissa?
I think that, part of ISIS's success has been the fact that they're winning. I mean, their PR machine, of course they would want to claim responsibility for it because it fuels their PR machine. And that's just another level of the threat that is posed by ISIS in this situation.
All right, JJ, last word to you.
I mean, I think that it's worth noting that with some of these, and this is an underreported aspect, is that with some of these hostage takings, it's the people that are sort of the more bleeding heart kind of types who are trying to buy off these sort of hostage takings, give in to the terrorist demands, pay the ransoms, which is what a number of these European countries have done, which is in part providing the revenue that is keeping these terrorists afloat. So I do think it's important that we understand, as tragic as these hostage takings are, as tragic as these murders often are, oftentimes the alternative can be even worse.
Okay, great discussion. Thanks to all three of you, JJ McCullough, Marissa Semke, and John Downs, for joining us on a debate that will rage on, no doubt about it.